So welcome everyone. I'm standing in, and what I'm going to bring is my own take on this, and I'm bringing you a compassion-focused approach. But I want to put this into context. This is work that and a presentation that I've used throughout the last 3 years, particularly during times of COVID, but actually it's relevant anytime, and it's based on the work of Professor Paul Gilbert, and it's called Compassion-Focused Theory Model. So the compassion-focused approach. What's my aims for today is just to introduce you to it, to understand it in terms of our resilience, and think about how we apply that to not just ourselves, but with others as well, and provide you today with an opportunity and a space to reflect and share in relation to this. So resilience, we might be sick of this word, to be honest. We might think, oh, I hear enough about it. And it has so many different meanings, and I'm using this one here, but there are endless different ways in which you can think about it. It could be bounce back ability, it could be flexibility, emotional strength. But what I want to get across is actually it's not a case of we are or aren't resilient. It's just actually that depending on the factors, and it can vary over time. So depending what we're facing, depending how the day has gone, the emotional, the physical, and the social, environmental elements around us can mean that on the day, sometimes we go, I can usually cope with this, but sometimes it's like, my God, what's wrong with me? So sometimes it just depends. But we are all resilient and all able to cope at different times, and actually it's about thinking about what are tipping me in the scale of one direction or another, and how might I think about that. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is taking a moment to think about, and if you do this just now, think about the factors that might be testing your ability to cope. Thinking about in this here and now. You've joined us today, so that's great. You're taking some time to yourself to consider your own resilience, and that's great. But just think about those moments where sometimes you just go, what's going on here? It's thinking about, actually, this is not necessarily a healthy approach to think about, and what we might think about is thinking about this in terms of our own resilience. That it's not always a great idea to think that if I just keep going, if I just keep calm, that things will work through. Because actually, for us, it's not necessarily healthy. When something threatens us, fear is the healthy response. If we lose something we value, then grief is a healthy response. And sometimes a slogan like this can make us think that there's something wrong with us. And it can be quite blaming. And actually, where I want to shift to is, it is very dependent on the circumstances. It's very dependent on where we're at. So keeping calm and carrying on is not necessarily a healthy approach. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at this compassion-focused approach, we have 3 systems, 3 modes in which we're operating. And it's useful just to think about these, that as you can see, these are in different parts of our brains. They trigger different parts of our chemical systems. And therefore, actually, it's just constantly is in our bodies, this, if you think about it, in these drive and threat and soothe modes. My threat mode gets raised when I have to say some of these words, because actually my pronunciations aren't great. So I'm just going to let you look at them for the moment, and I'll bring them in later. So that's how I deal with that one. But if we think about it, human beings are amazing, and they have the most impressive built-in systems, and each of which are really important in their own right. And at the core of this compassion-focused theory by Paul Gilbert is that we have these emotions for reasons. Human life is complicated and we are vulnerable. And to negotiate life successfully, we have to avoid the dangers, we have to gather the things we need and avoid the things that need us, and we have to maintain relationships. And to do this, we have to make countless decisions every day. So many, there's no way in which we could keep up with that. There's no way in which we could just do that. So our bodies have built in a way in which we shortcut those decisions. And that's what I'm going to talk about how do we create the space when those emotions, be that threat or drive or soothe or heighten, how do we reconnect with ourselves? There's some theory, and I think I read it somewhere, so don't quote me on this, that we only have the capacity to make about 600 decisions a day. And then when we get to that 600, it becomes very difficult. And the way in which I put that into context is when you start out that day, when you're on the day where you go, right, I'll have no crisps, I'm not going to have that glass of wine tonight. and you get to the end of the day and you've made 600 decisions, you kind of go, oh, just give me that packet of crisps, just give me that nice treat, because we've not managed, we can't cope much more than that. So with kindness, I allow myself that glass of wine occasionally and I go, well, I've made the 600 decisions today. But there are a number of difficulties with this increasingly successful world. We can find ourselves responding to triggers that might not actually be real. And therefore, it's thinking about, for resilience or flexibility, it's not about always never feeling anger or fear. It's not always about putting your feelings aside to do your job. It isn't about never or always anything. It's about having an understanding of how we feel, what has triggered that feeling, and being able to make a judgment about whether this is a helpful system to have activated and what it might help us to deactivate or activate another system. And they're each different and they influence in a different way. They each bring gifts, so I'll talk about that, but they each come with a cost. And therefore, what I'm going to do is take you through this and each one individually. So, thinking about our threat mode. So it's evolved to protect us. It's quite, primeval, if you want. It's, back to that tribal space. It's about, that protecting ourselves, and that's innate in us, that sense, and defending ourselves. So really important, really useful to think about. It involves one or more uncomfortable emotions. So when we feel, whether it's fear, guilt, shame, or anger, those are when your threat system's being triggered. And remember, it's about your adrenaline and your cortisol. Sometimes we talk about that amygdala hijack. So when we see the red mist come down, or when we feel real guilt or shame around something, that uncomfortable feeling. So think about it in those terms. And what it does is it directs our behavior to deter, to evade, to alleviate those sources of threat. So that becomes what we're focused on. And then it assumes, it always gives that presumption that we're better safe than sorry, a very common phrase in my world. So if something might be a problem, then we're going to assume it is, and we're going to act in relation to that. So these are all helpful elements of it. And where it can cause us issues is what it does is it distracts us and our attention from anything else. It filters out everything else. We're focused on that. And therefore, we're directing all our attention to detect and monitor that threat. So that can feel a bit more heightened. And actually, what does that lead to? Well, if it's overactivated, i.e. if the threat mode is too much for the need, so actually if I'm not saying it's, so if it's over much, then it can leave us reactive, preoccupied and paranoid at times. So you think about that sort of, if you're crossing a road and suddenly you step out and a car whizzes past, then that adrenaline rush comes in. Threat mode is heightened, and then we're really on high alert about how we're going about that. And then how do you calm that down? How do you think about that in that time? So really, really thoughtful around those things. So that's the threat mode. And if we move into drive and we think about it, this is the one that's aimed, this is the dopamine, the one that we tap into, where we get those successes, those rewards, those resources that we need to seek. And it involves those more pleasant and energetic emotions: excitement, curiosity, confidence, achievement. So when you're feeling really buoyed and you're feeling really good, that's your drive mode kicking in. And it directs us and our behavior to push and strive for what we want and what we need. And that can be in a work, and that can be a home environment. Just think about it, think about your own context. And therefore it gives us the energy and focus. It keeps our eyes on the prize. It makes us think about that ahead. And it directs our attention to seek and obtain that object, whatever that is of our focus. And that can be different things for different people. However, the cost of it is when it's overactivated, when our drive mode is excessive or exclusive, we can become compulsive, impulsive, restless, impatient, and the worrying one, burnt out. And perhaps we've seen that over time. And if you think particularly back to COVID, that perhaps we were in drive mode or we were in threat mode as well. But in drive mode, it was maybe leading us to do too much, to force ourselves into spaces, to seek things out. I'll bring a bit of humour to this, because where I think about this when I go back to that space was, I remember walking along the street one day and seeing a car stop and a person go into a shop, and they came out with what looked like toilet rolls, Remember those days when you couldn't find them? And I was like, oh, is it toilet rolls? And actually what it was kitchen roll. And therefore I had to put it into context, go, Michelle, you've got enough toilet rolls at home. You don't need this. And go, like, calm this down, this drive to have. Remember the days when you couldn't get flour and you couldn't get pasta, yeast was a thing that was difficult to get. So we would have had those elements that we were trying to strive to attain, eyes on the prize. So if we bring in the soothe, this is where oxytocins and opiates come in. And it's often the one that we probably do neglect. And this is the one I want to bring to your attention a bit more and talk a lot about. That actually this is the mode, the system, when we tap into the prefrontal cortex, those opiates, those oxytocins, that helps us rest, reset, and think. And what else does it do? It helps us tap into those pleasant and calm emotions, safety and connection and ease. And it directs our behavior to pause, connect, and regulate. So those excess physical, emotional arousal in our system and others. And when I think about that one, what I think about, it makes me think about if your drive and your threat system is a bicycle careering down a hill, that's you in excess physical emotional arousal. And what your soothe mode is, it's the brake. It's not about stopping it, it's just about slowing it down so that you can pause and connect and just tap into yourself. And what does that mean? Well, it allows us to sleep and digest our food. It allows our bodies to repair. It nurtures our relationships, and it makes us enable us to think calmly and clearly. And that directs our attention to that bigger picture, to notice and reflect on what's important. And perhaps we've done that over the last few years to think actually where our relationships are important or the work that we do is important. Perhaps that's allowed us, when we've had that time, to put things into context and think about that. However, when it's overused, we can become inactive, directionless, and stagnant. It often makes me think of teenagers, and I know that's been a bit unfair, but that thing of too much, even of soothe, is not a great thing. But where I want to place this today as this system is actually thinking that we have our own 3 systems running to manage and to consider. But so do the people across from us. So do those clients, our patients, our colleagues, our family members have their own systems too. And for me, it's just about actually pausing and creating that soothe space to think about actually what does this mean. Take a moment just to think about how does this model help you understand some of your own and other people's reactions. Can you think about times when your drive or threat mode maybe being a bit unhelpful? And what does set off your threat system? How does that impact on how you think or feel or behave? And I'm gonna just move forward and let's talk about the next bit, about that balance. Because it isn't about not having threat system, it is a helpful system. It's not about not having drive system. That's really helpful too. That gets us things done, it gets us that promotion, it gets us the work achieved, and the threat system protects us from things. It's about having that balance. It's about thinking our emotional self-care. So being aware of those triggers that might threaten our system, thinking about the helpful coping strategies that we know that we have and we tap into, but often we forget. It's about choosing those activities that can help you switch off and actually minimizing some of the less helpful coping strategies. Taking time either to be alone or with people, it's different for us in different times. But importantly, maybe taking a day or a week at a time. Connecting with nature is a great one in terms of our own emotional and physical well-being. So thinking about that physical self-care, how are we looking after what we're eating? And that can be hard in a workplace at times, but how are we doing that? It can be about the physical intimacy that we have with our family or friends, and that's really important. Sleep, oh gosh, sleep is such a necessary element in there. And regular exercise, whatever that is. Importantly, and I used to talk about this a lot, taking your breaks. Now I get that's difficult in the workspace. I get that's really hard. And also factoring things like annual leave in. Having that holiday in your head. Where am I going? What am I going to do? How am I going to use that downtime? And also that social self-care, so letting others know when you need them. Too often we're probably being self-reliant. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Too often we maybe don't reach out to people and connect and look for that support. And do we reach out to those that energize us and minimize the contact with those that maybe take from us, and that's not helpful. It's very much centrally about that self-compassion for ourselves, to look after ourselves. If you look at and monitor the compassion in your life, what we will find, and it's probably no surprise in the sector that we work in, that we give a lot to others. So that compassion that we have, we offer to others. Maybe where we're not so great is actually receiving that from other people. So when people show us kindness, we might just brush it off and go, it's okay, I'm fine. So we're not great at receiving that compassion, however it is. But also, so the main bit is actually where we're least good is that self-to-self compassion. We often refer to, and if you think about it, that putting your oxygen mask on first. It's probably the last thing we do, and yet it should be one of the first things we consider. So what I am going to ask, what are the things that activate your soothe systems? What are your go-tos? My love, and I'll go to it as a Ted Lasso episode or something similar in our household. And it's remembering these things. So these are the things that we need to remember and think about. How do we build that in? How do we take that forward? So the power of the soothe mode. And what I'm going to say is this is not an optional extra. This is something that we need to pay attention to. We need to find time. Because as I said, it takes the foot off the gas of the threat and drive. It allows us to have that bigger picture thinking. It allows us to slow it down. It allows us to consider, is this helpful? Is this useful? What mode do I need to bring in here? What do I need to kick in? And it helps you listen not only to others, but actually to yourself. What is my body telling me? What is it saying? Is it saying, Michelle, you need to get outside and have some fresh air? Is it saying you need a bit extra sleep tonight? Is it saying that you need to have some time to yourself? That's my general go-tos. Because what we need to think about is that the soothe system, those opiates, those oxytocins, they are the things that help your body to rest and repair and to sleep and digest your food. So do think about, how do I bring this in a little bit more? How do I invest in me? How do I invest in the Soothe TV? Developing the routines around this. We fall away. We're really, habits take a lot to build. So I know that I fall in love and fall out of love with yoga at times, but I do know when I go back to it, how much it makes me feel better. And I'm looking forward to the knee being a little bit better and doing that a bit more. But how do we build in, for not only for ourselves, but with our colleagues, those practices of breaks and pauses and times for reflection? If there was anything I learned of and if you go back to that point about how we give compassion, if you buddy up with someone, they'll look after you. They'll say, have you had your water? Have you had your coffee? You're looking a bit dehydrated. We won't necessarily do it for ourselves. So think about buddying up with someone. Think about, how do I use and lean into the fact that I know self-care is the last thing I'll do, but I might care for someone else and they can care back for me. So build those relationships where the communication can happen and where it's not catastrophic. Notice and adjust our self-talk. We have got inside us those calm and wise inner coaches. They're sitting there on your shoulder. Just to remember the sort of thing that I often say when I'm coaching is, what would be the advice that you would give to a friend? If you were to write a letter to someone else, or you were to say to someone else, what would be that advice? Because it's always going to be different. It's going to be less harsh. It's going to be more thoughtful. It's going to give you more time. So think about that inner coach. So I'm going to bring you a bit of instant soothe, and that's about breathing. Who would have thought? The thing that we do naturally is the thing that is actually the most effective at reducing stress. And there's a Harvard Business Review article that proves this, so I'm not just talking. It has shown that studies found it outperformed other techniques over both the short and long term. So what I'm going to do is then I'm going to ask you to sit, find a comfortable space, get those feet on the ground, and you could drop your eyes, close your eyes. And we're just going to do a couple of minutes of breathing, because in 2 minutes, your soothe system will be activated. So go with me on this one. I want you to breathe in for 4, and notice where the tension is in your body. And then pause and breathe out and release that tension. For 6. And pause and breathe in. Notice where that tension is. Breathe into where that tension is for 1, 2, 3, 4, and breathe out. Might even make a noise for 6. You find your own pace with this, but slowly and smoothly, steadily. Breathe into where that tension is. Pause and breathe out. And pause and breathe out. And in that time, hopefully the tension is gone from where your shoulders is. Well, for me, it's my shoulders. Hopefully you've engaged with those oxytocins, those opiates. And in 2 minutes, we kick in that system. An important thing is to think, how do I build that into my practice? How do I wriggle that into my day? Where can I do this? Could be on the toilet. If you go for your break, it's probably the only place you can close the door and be away from everyone sometimes. But just take those minutes to breathe. It's as simple as 2 minutes. And that's been 3. There we go. Hopefully you found that helpful just to connect in. So what I'm going to move on is just come back to that bit about actually how we communicate and how we can build this into our understanding of those communications and understanding of others. Thinking about this model and how we use it for ourselves and for others, about what might be your threats, what is triggering those reactions. Get to know that. Just accept that's part of who you are, but actually what is it that we do with that? What is it we do with that knowledge, that self-awareness that we have? How might we dial down that threat? Just because it feels right doesn't mean it's useful. So just because in that circumstance we might raise our shoulders, push ourselves forward, shout a little bit. How do we pause? How do we breathe? How do we connect? And how do we think about, is that threat mode the right thing? What might else I need to do? We might have to be selective about that drive. Because actually drive means that we're often not listening to ourselves and to others. So actually it can get in the way of what we're thinking or what we're listening to. So the sort of the levels at which we're listening, are we listening to just respond, which is not useful to ourselves or to the person in front of us? Or are we listening to what is going on in front of us? Don't rely on assumptions, it says. So the old adage of assuming it makes an ass out of you and me. Try and think, where is that other person coming from? How are their modes? What are their systems at? Because it's sometimes if we're assuming something, if we're thinking something where maybe it's incomplete, we don't have the full information in front of us. And probably what we need to do is ask and be curious. And that's where that leads us into, how do we create that space between ourselves and the other person? How do we minimize that need for anyone else to interpret what we're saying or to mind read or read between the lines? So how do we communicate clearly about actually what we might need or what we are thinking in a way that's compassionate, in a way which considers the person in front of us, which isn't just coming from, this is what I need to say, but actually, how do I need to be heard perhaps sometimes? How do we create that safety and not be a source of threat? So I was telling Victoria and Linda and Andrea, who are on today with me, this is my voice for these sessions. If my family heard this, they kind of go, but you normally mumble and you speak so quickly. So how do you create that space and not be a source of threat? That can be about your body language. That can be about how you're speaking. That can be about the environment you're in. It can be about a number of things. So how do we look to create that safety. And how are we coming across? Are we aware of the eye rolling that we might do? Are we aware of the look we might give that we're sometimes just not mindful of? How might we trigger someone's systems? And how are we approaching people? Always, I would say, try and do it from a stance of curiosity. Try to think, what mode are they in? Where might this behaviour coming from? And how might this I be making this word, or how can I make them feel heard and soothed? So the final slide I'm going to put up is just remember this. You wouldn't let this happen to your phone, so don't let it happen to you. So in addition to these resources, the other ones I would point you in direction of is there's the National Wellbeing Hub that has a whole lot of different links in it to self-help, self-care, but also a lot of videos around, or blogs and things. And it also talks about resources that are available in your local area as well as nationally. And we'll put a link into that. And there's also the on Turas, you can access the toolkit that was developed during COVID, but it's still, as I would say, relevant now about actually taking that time to think about the things that trigger you, and think about the things that you know can help and support you to alleviate or to bring those back into a sort of red, amber and green scale of things. So do look at those. And also we will post some links. So a colleague who I worked quite closely with during this is Ellie Caldwell, and you would have seen her name on some of the slides, and she did a few more Vimeos and videos in a bit more detail. So she talks about the 3 systems, and there's part 1 and part 2, and she also gave things like stress bucket and how to anchor ourselves as other sessions that you might want to tap into. Have a great day, have a great week. Thank you so much.